First-year quarterbacks in a Ryan Day system have proven to be more than just effective. In fact, they've been explosive. These are year-one stats since 2018, a year after Day took over the offense and a year before he was the full-time head man. Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields, C.J. Stroud all posted video game numbers. Kyle McCord was solid, if not spectacular, in 2023. Here's new OC Chip Kelly on what we could see in 2024, no matter who gets the job.
No, it's just, we're just trying to, as I told the players, don't count your reps, make your reps count. And I think they're doing a good job, all of them. We're still kind of going through that. I would say probably towards the end of this week, we'll start to kind of hone in on it. But it's part of is when he in. Now, the day of the lineup changes every day, like who's in with what group, and just kind of mixing and matching right now. But we're all just trying to make the most of our reps, be valuable because of how we're doing it. And a lot of it's two fields. So we got two different groups going on at the same time. And with two different groups going on at the same time, there's a bunch of reps to be had. You know, our first practice, I think we had 96 team reps in the first practice. So there's enough to go around right now. When we start to consolidate and stop doing the two field works and start to get into one field work, then I think you got to start to kind of cut the reps down for some people.
Chip Kelly playing it close to the vest. For more on all things Ohio State, welcome in Dan Hope of 11 Warriors. Dan, we know that Chip has to say the right things right now. We're a long time away from the opener. We don't know exactly when a starter will be named. We presume it's going to be Will Howard. What do you think of Howard's status as the presumed starter right now, no matter what the coaching staff is saying?
I think he's definitely the front runner. I think, based on what we've seen so far in preseason camp, the amount of first team reps he's gotten, like you said, I don't think Chip wanted to break any news on Tuesday, but they don't give out reps randomly. There's a reason why Will Howard's been taking most of the first team reps, and that's because he is the front runner to be the starting quarterback, and he always has been. You don't bring in a quarterback like Will Howard from the transfer portal who has 4 years partially of starting experience and bring him in to be the backup quarterback. And so I do think that in the spring that, Will had some rough patches, and that kind of left the door open for Devin Brown and even Julian Say and the freshman to, get into that mix. But either one of those guys was going to have to clearly outperform Will Howard in order to take the starting job away from him. And I think so far in camp, Will has been the best quarterback.
I know you guys at 11 Warriors were part of a group that got to hear Howard address the media earlier in the week. What are your impressions right now of him as both a player and maybe as a person?
Yeah, I think as a person, as a leader, I think he's got a great attitude for what Ohio State needs him to be as a leader of his team. And I think he understands his role in this offense. When you have Travion Henderson, when you have Quinshon Judkins, when you have Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss, they don't necessarily need him to be the next C.J. Stroud or Justin Fields. They just need him to be an effective manager of this offense. And I think that's really what they're hoping that he can be, as someone who has 27 games of starting experience under his belt. I don't think that he has necessarily that same deep passing ability as a C.J. Stroud had for Ohio State a couple years ago, but I think he's been effective in camp in the short and intermediate passing game, and then he also gives them that running threat, which is something they really haven't had at the quarterback position the last few years, but is something that both Ryan Day and Chip Kelly have identified that they need more of from the quarterback position this year.
I'm glad you brought up some names of former quarterbacks. We could throw Justin Fields in there as well. It appears, at least on the surface, that Howard is more of a Kyle McCord than he was a Haskins or a Stroud or a Fields. So does that mean that the offensive philosophy this year is much more in line than what we saw in 2023, as opposed to when we saw those quarterbacks putting up monster numbers in previous years?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect, Will Howard's going to go out and throw for 5,000 yards. I think that would be unrealistic expectations. But I think the good thing for this offense is, again, you have Travion Henderson and you have Quinshon Judkins. And so you don't necessarily need to have huge passing numbers for this to be an effective offense, because you should have the best running back tandem in the country. Now, at the same time, you have, Jeremiah Smith, who's maybe the most exciting freshman in the country. Emeka Egbuka, who's one of the best receivers in college football. You have Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss, who there's very high expectations for both of them going into their sophomore year at wide receiver. So even without Marvin Harrison Jr., this still might be the best receiving core in the country. And so I still expect this to be an explosive offense through the air. I don't know, again, that you can expect Will Howard to make all the throws that C.J. Stroud was making a couple of years ago. But the thing you see in practice, too, is, sometimes Will might be a little bit off with that deep ball, but Jeremiah or Carnell can still go make a play on that ball because they're so talented. And when they're doing that against, Denzel Burke and Davis and Igbinosun, you'd expect they can do that against pretty much any team in the country.
Yeah, and it would be remarkably unfair for anybody to compare a quarterback in college football to C.J. Stroud. When we're seeing what he's doing at the NFL level, it's just not a fair comparison right now. You've already answered any questions I was going to have about the receiver room because it is remarkably loaded, and it's crazy what they continue to do at that position, producing NFL talent after NFL talent. But the running back room I want to dive into a little bit more because it's fascinating that Travion was there and Quinshawn decides I can come in and maybe a part of this room as well. I know so much has to be decided, but if you were to guess, is this a scenario where we begin splitting carries and ultimately decide on one guy, or do you think both guys will get heavy usage if they stay healthy?
I think both guys will get heavy usage if they stay healthy. I mean, I think these are two guys, you could put them both in the top 5 running backs in college football. And so I don't think the plan is ever going to be for, one guy to sit on a bench for an entire game and watch the other guy run. I think, especially when you factor in what this team wants to do, which is, of course, get to the national championship game, that means playing at least 16 games. And so I think the idea of being able to split carries for both of those guys throughout the season improves the likelihood that you're going to be able to keep both of them healthy. And that is something they really need because the depth behind them is a little bit questionable. The only other 2 scholarship running backs they have are James Peoples and Sam Williams-Dixon, who are both freshmen. Now, I've been impressed by what I've seen from both of them in camp. And so I think if Ohio State needs them to play, they can give them some quality carries, but you don't want to have to rely heavily on a freshman. And so I think the hope really is you try to keep both Travion and Quinshawn as fresh as possible during the regular season so that you have them both for that 2-headed monster down the stretch run.
Of course, you have to have guys blocking, and the offensive line has seemingly been a huge part of the conversation over the last 2 or 3 years. It's all been about one missing spot and finding one guy to give them a fluid 5. Where are they right now in terms of being confident in maybe at least 5 or more than 5 guys being able to do the job on the O-line?
Yeah, so I think the big question right now is at that right guard spot. They've got Tegra Shabola, who was a top backup last year, and then Carson Hinsman, who was the starting center last year. They're kind of battling at that right guard spot with Seth McLaughlin coming in from Alabama to take over the center position. And so I think they've got 4 pretty solidified starters now. Josh Simmons is a guy that they feel really confident in, that he can make a big jump in year 2 at left tackle. Donovan Jackson, if he plays up to his ability, can be one of the best guards in college football. Seth McLaughlin had those snapping issues at Alabama, but they seem confident that, that's going to be a thing of the past and he's going to be a really solid center for them. And then Josh Pryor had some issues as a pass protector last year at right tackle, but they're optimistic that he's going to be able to make some big strides there as well. So it's really a matter of filling that right guard spot. They like what they've seen from both Tegra Shabola and Carson Hinsman. Don't think they're at the point yet of being ready to name either one of those guys a starter, so that still remains the question mark spot. But I do think there's more cautious optimism on this offensive line this year than there was at this time a year ago.
Listen, I think everybody understands when we focus and talk more about the offense when it's a Ryan Day and now Chip Kelly-led offense. But defensively, you had multiple starters return, guys that could have been high-round NFL draft picks. So I'm curious, what have you heard from guys like JTT and Jack Sawyer and Denzel Burke in terms of why they decided to come back for another year when they most certainly didn't have to?
Well, I think a big reason was they didn't beat Michigan last year. They haven't beaten Michigan for the last 3 years. And those are guys now going into their senior year at Ohio State where if they don't beat Michigan this year, they're going to leave Ohio State without a pair of gold pants. And so I think that was a big reason, for all those seniors, whether it's the defensive guys like Denzel Burke and Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, or offensive guys like Travion Henderson and Emeka Egbuka. They've all said a big reason why they all decided to come back was because they haven't achieved their goals, which, Ryan Day says what the goals are every year. It's beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win the national championship. They have not achieved any of those goals yet. So I think all those guys really kind of came together and said, we want to make one last ride at this. If we all come back together, we have a chance to be the best team in the country. And I think, that's really what people are feeling right now inside the Woody Hayes Athletic Center.
Dan, I know you've heard the question. I know you've heard Ryan Day answer it, and he answers it the way that you would expect him to answer it. Every year, the expectations are exactly what you just laid out. But to me, and I'd love to hear if you agree, this seems more like the must-win year than any other in his history as a head coach, not just because of the losses to Michigan the last 3 years, but also because of what Michigan lost, and also because it's a new era in the Big Ten. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, you see your rivals go and win the national championship last year after you've lost to them 3 years in a row. I mean, 100% that game at the end of November, that's the one Ryan Day really needs to win. But I think really there is that, quote unquote, natty or bust mindset in Columbus this year, because, this roster, I think, maybe, 2019 was up there, but other than that, this is the best roster Ryan Day has had in Columbus. And I think, this is the roster. If you don't win with this roster, then there's going to be questions, because there's just so much talent on this team on both sides of the ball. We talked about quarterback, we talked about offensive line, but there's not really any glaring weaknesses with this team. And so you just look at the talent they have across the board. They should be right up there, I think, with Georgia as the two best teams in college football this year. And, anything less than, beating Michigan and winning the Big Ten and making a deep college football playoff run is going to be seen as a disappointment this year.
Great stuff and insight from Dan Hope of 11 Warriors. Dan, we truly appreciate it. Look forward to talking with you throughout the course of the season.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.